One of the biggest pain points for a lot of women coming out of the divorce is obviously worrying about the emotional well-being of their kids.
It is not divorce that is traumatic for children. It is parental conflict that is traumatic for children.
What would you say is the most important first step for successful co-parenting?
It's really, really challenging, but I think very essential to change the mindset from a spouse to a co-parent.
Hi, Morgan. I'm so happy to see you.
Hi, Amber. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, okay. Well, so what the listeners don't know is that we are friends and we've been friends for a very long time. This goes back to, 20 years, I would say, right?
20 years.
About 20
decades.
years, right? Yes. We definitely, we've seen, each other get married and divorced and this and that. And so, it's just so funny that both of us now where we are, in our 40s are on a similar path of really kind of on this mission to help divorced women. And obviously we're going about it a couple, different ways, but, I love your story of, being an attorney and then just really wanting to step away from really what was the kind of you wanting to like step away from like working for like the big firm and all of that stuff? Like what was kind of like that drive for you?
It sort of came from two angles. I've always, for the entire 20 years of my legal career, felt like the law practice was a little too narrow for my naturally creative, problem-solving, entrepreneurial spirit and mindset.
Yeah.
But clearly over 20 years, that wasn't enough to motivate me to leave. What honestly motivated me to leave at the end of the traditional practice was when I started seeing that not only wasn't it using all of my best skills because the legal realm was just so narrow, but I also saw that it wasn't helping clients in the best way. When you're dealing with traditional litigation, you are so limited in the issues that you can potentially solve and the ways that you can solve them. And what I saw, I was doing divorce law, so I was dealing with lots of people getting divorced and dealing with custody issues. And I really came to believe that the litigation process itself was really harmful to families. And I also recognized that the process of divorce and recovering after that and embracing that new chapter in your life where you're a single mom or you're co-parenting, it involves the whole person, right? It needs to be an integrated process. It involves your emotional self. It involves your, psychology. There's kind of therapeutic elements involved. There's overall health and wellness involved. It affects our careers. There's so many different ways that it impacts our lives. And I just felt like I was dealing with such a narrow sliver of being able to help families. And so I wanted to be able to really take a more holistic approach and not be limited in some of the ways that you are at a traditional law firm.
Well, I freaking love that. And, what I'm noticing on social media is there's more and more attorneys who have been in like that divorce space. I had, we talked about Dennis Vetrano. I had him on not that long ago, but that are, I think, having this kind of realization for you. I think that's such an aha to be like, the litigation process and all that, it does not help families, and it does not help the co-parenting process. And in fact, I think it makes it more contentious. It's definitely, that's hard. And so I love that you are, that you stepped out of that and of now wanting to help women. So I want to dive into just some quick rapid fire questions as I always do.
Great.
Yeah. So what is the number one mistake women in midlife make when they're trying to get unstuck, whether that's a divorce, a career change, or just feeling complacent in their lives? Like, what do you think is the number one mistake women make? And then how can they avoid it?
I think the number one mistake that women make, and we all do this, is we are almost compulsively putting others before ourselves.
Mm,
Always, always, always. And I think sometimes that comes with a sense of martyrdom. Sometimes that comes
yes.
with a sense of like, woe is me. It often comes with a sense of being overwhelmed. And I am such a huge believer, and I say this to women clients all the time. You have to put your mask on first, right?
Hmm.
And I'm sure you notice it in your life. I certainly notice it in my life. I am a better parent on the days that I feel rested and pretty and,
Yes. Yes.
balanced. And when I've gotten some exercise and gotten outside and done something nice for myself. I mean, when I am the most short tempered and the most ineffectual with my kids is when I put myself last.
Yes, I love that. So what do you think is kind of one way, because this is tough, right? This is a tough question, but like how can women just maybe one step they can do to avoid really falling into that trap of putting everybody else first?
Well, I think it's a shift in mindset. I
Yeah.
think it is recognizing that by caring for ourselves, we actually are caring for others.
Yes.
I think once we accept that and recognize that it really has to be a priority because you cannot effectively care for others. And, a trend that we see in women, I think increasingly so, particularly in our generation, women always sort of managed the household and managed kids. And we're often still doing all of that and having huge careers and often being the primary breadwinner.
Yes.
So we have all of these things on our plate, and it's really, really, really hard to juggle. And the only way any of us can hope to do it is if we take adequate time to really care for ourselves.
I love that 1000%. So in your experience, what is well, actually this may be the most this kind of answers it. It was like what's the most effective mindset shift that someone can make to start moving forward? And I don't know, maybe you would answer that the same way, which is yeah, taking care of yourself. I don't know.
Think I would, but I mean, I would also add that I think we become so attuned to being the fixer in the
Mm,
family, right? Fixing everything for the kids. I can't find my shoe. I don't know where my homework is,
yes.
like,
Get me
you
water.
know, exactly. What time does the flight leave? I mean, like things that everyone else like could really figure out, but like
Yes.
we end up being the ones that have to figure it out. And I think that we sort of get to this place where we think that if we're not juggling all of the balls ourselves at every moment, that everyone else around us is going to fall to pieces.
Mm.
And I think part of learning to prioritize yourself is also recognizing that, like, your kids aren't going to die if you go on vacation for a long weekend,
Right.
right? Like,
right.
they will be fine, even if they have to go to the doctor. Like,
Right.
I
right.
mean, my kids have been staying with my parents this week. And do I think that they've gone to bed past their bedtime? Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Do I think
Yeah.
that they've eaten different food? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are they going to be totally fine? Yes. And I know that I needed this week to focus on this client who was in town from London. And, I had like a moment of mom guilt and then said, put that aside. Like, this is exactly what I need to be doing, and
Yeah.
it's important to my family that my career is successful. And it's important to me that I have this time. And so part of being able to put yourself first and do that shift in mindset is also acknowledging that the people around us can survive without our micromanaging every part of every day.
Yes, 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 yes. I mean, yeah, and something for me, that's something, now that my kids too are getting to be a little bit older. I mean, it's, Shaw's 11, Avery's 13 now, and like they are capable of doing things. Like, guess what? And I've gotten to the point now where, like, even with laundry, I'm like, you know what? Guess what? Mom will wash it and I'm going to separate it. But if you want your clothes folded, I'm probably going to get some judgment from some of my listeners. But guess what? You want your clothes folded, you can fold it. You're 13. Fold your laundry and put it away. Like this, like at some point, I'm like, I've got to stop. Or you're sitting down and you want a glass of water. Mom, can you get me water? No. Get up
Right.
and even if but you're right there. I know I'm right here, but get up and get it yourself. Like there's
You know
gotta
what? Those are life skills.
Yes.
You have to learn that. And learning to pull yourself up by your bootstraps is wildly, wildly important. And honestly, when people don't develop those muscles, when kids don't develop those muscles, it's so much harder later in life to become self-sufficient. I mean, I always joke about Tuck, my 8-year-old, that like he might starve. Like if I didn't eventually just like get him the snack or whatever, I have a snack drawer that the kids can reach, both kids, even the 3-year-old,
Yeah.
everything in it is healthy. It's inbounds whenever they want a snack. Cause I was like, I cannot spend more time getting snacks for my children. Like
Right.
it's like a constant cycle of getting snacks. So, I mean, and I often say to Tuck, because he'll be like, it's okay, mom. I'll just wait. If you're busy, I'll just wait. I mean, he's really sweet about it. But I'm like, buddy, eventually you're going to get hungry enough that you're going to open that fridge yourself. Like,
Right. Well, and the other thing that I think of too is, what's important to me is not like generationally repeating the cycle. So, what I mean by that is, I don't want Avery to grow up thinking, my daughter, that this is the role of the mom, that the mom just does everything for everybody all the time. And then she repeats that. I don't want my son growing up thinking that the wife has to take care of everything, right? Like, I want to raise some independent damned kids. And so sometimes I think that we can kind of get stuck as moms, especially God, my single moms, right? Where we feel like we're just constantly doing for everybody all the time. But I think we kind of have to pull back sometimes and be like, okay, like what's the message I'm sending my kids right now by doing everything for them all the time? And that's something I think about a lot.
right. And I think one of the messages we're sending is you're not capable of doing it yourself. And then
Right.
another message we're sending is it's okay for me to do everything for you. And again,
Yes.
the number of expectations that are on women, as I said, in our generation, because I think we're sort of sandwiched between a couple of generations where either, our moms either, worked and had a lot of help, or they didn't work and they stayed home. I mean, this generation of women, I feel like all of my peers have like, way, way, way more on their plate in terms of just like the responsibility to the family, particularly single moms. And, it is a borderline impossible juggling act. And so if we also feel like we need to micromanage everything for our family members, it's going to be it'll catch up with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I know one of the things you talk a lot about, in fact, you've got some exciting things you're releasing in January around this topic, but you talk a lot about co-parenting and successful co-parenting. And so what would you say is the most important first step for successful co-parenting?
Great question. And again, the first step is a shift in mindset. And this is really, really hard because often you've been partnered with someone or married to someone for a really long time, and we have certain expectations of our spouse, right? And we're very involved with the life of our spouse. It's really, really challenging, but I think very essential to change the mindset from a spouse to a co parent.
Mm,
And part of that is learning what to let go of. That's
mm,
probably the most important part, right?
mm.
I mean, for example, my ex-husband, who I adore and is a wonderful co-parent, you know, I will see him wearing like the same outfit for the third day in a row.
Wait,
And,
your kid, well, you'll see the ex-husband or the kid wearing the same
oh no,
outfit?
my ex-husband, I would
Oh.
never let my children wear the same outfit. And I'm like, dude, like if he was my husband, I would be like, no, 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 no. I mean,
Yeah.
please
Yeah.
put on some clean clothes, sir. But I'm
Right.
like, not my problem.
Not
This
my
is not my
problem.
problem anymore, So it's like learning the things that you don't have to insert yourself about or like worry about. Um, and really, really, really trying to challenge yourself to like hold that boundary and not overstep. We're never going to be perfect, but like really try to solidify that boundary in your mind of like what I don't have to do. So then you can focus the energy on the things where you do have to interact with one another. And the key to successful co-parenting is turning down the dial and having a low conflict co-parenting situation. We're not always going to agree. Often relationships, if you've divorced, are fraught with like some baggage from that process. Um, but my entire goal is to get to a place not where everyone's best friends. I happen to be very close with my ex, but that's not going to be right for everyone. The goal isn't your best friends and you hang out all the time. The goal is where the co-parenting relationship can be a positive influence in your life and a
Yeah.
positive things for the children, and not something that is sort of sucking our energy because it's a high conflict situation.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think for me, I definitely love like this idea of like really shifting the mindset of like, okay, this is not my spouse anymore. This is a co-parent. I need to like remember that. I think for me too, like the biggest shift was really just really having this mindset of like, yeah, like is okay, like when he does something to trigger me. Cause guess what? I mean, like I think we all know, like, well, number one, if you have kids with your ex, you're tied to that person, pretty much at least until the kids are 18, but probably forever. Like that's just the way it's going to go. And this person knows you inside and out. And this person is going to trigger you just like I'm sure I trigger him and all the things. But I think what the biggest shift for me was really, really focusing on not operating from such a reactive space. And I think that especially when you are coming off the heels of divorce and especially like leading up to divorce, like I'm sure, like I know for me, yeah, there was a lot of fighting that went on. Yes, there was a lot of me always reacting from this reactive place. And I think that for me, it was learning how to really just take a beat. And when something happens where, he pisses me off or I piss him off, it's really, and this takes practice. This is hard, but it is just taking a beat and really just saying like, okay, is this worth it? We had a situation go down the other day, which was a couple weeks ago, where we were starting to get like really heated about the schedule. We have a very flexible schedule, and we were starting to have like a very contentious like back and forth, and I could just tell where this was going. And like he said something really pointed to me, and it was in response to something kind of pointed I said to him. And then all of a sudden, and my normal MO, especially while we were married or when we were like going through, is we would just engage and we would just kind of
Right.
go at it. And I just had to take a step back and be like, okay, you know what? Is this worth it? This is so not worth it right now. And so I just said, you know what? You're right. Like, I'm sorry. And I think that, like, and it's not always about like backing down and like eating crow and all of that, but I do think that it requires like looking at the situation, especially if you have an ex partner who doesn't necessarily back down so easy. I know for me, it's been really important to just be like, okay, you know what? Ooh, in the grand scheme of things, like this could get really ugly, and like this is so not worth it. Like, and so I'm just like, okay, you know what? You're right. Like, let's figure this out. I'm so sorry. Like, I appreciate you. And then that disarms him, and then we're like right back, and it's good. And was it hard? And is that like what I wanted to say? No, I wanted to say f off, and blah 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 blah. But then I was like, where is this going to get me? It's not like he's coming home to me tonight and we can like work it out, over dinner or over a drink or whatever. No, this is going to carry on, and this is going to make my life miserable for however long. And I'm just not like, it's not worth it. Right.
Well, and it's important to recognize and understand and kind of train yourself about there are certain things that it's important we agree on. Um, there are other things we don't always have to agree. And
Yes.
you're totally right, Amber, in that picking your battles is a really huge part of this.
Yeah.
And, and recognizing that there is actual value in building up some goodwill in that relationship. And what I often see in co-parenting relationships is if one person is willing to give and accommodate, um, usually the other person will reciprocate. And
Yeah.
often it lends itself to like that being more the trend. And if you dig in and if you're super strict and, no, I'm not going to give the kids to you 2 hours early so you can go to your mom's birthday party or whatever, if you kind of
Right.
are really harsh and overly strict about things, the next time you need a favor, you're probably going to be met with that in reverse. So we can control our destiny in that relationship by doing exactly what you did, which is like do the mental calculus of like, I know how to disarm the situation. It's very hard to do because it's, like we know or feel that we're right in that situation. But know when you don't need to prove you're right to the other person. You just have to reach a solution that's workable for the kids. And, picking your battles, there are going to be some things that are really, really important. Where your kids are going to school, whether or not they're getting a particular medical procedure. I mean, they're really big things that are important. And, other things like about the schedule where can you make an accommodation now?
Yeah.
Yes. And it's probably going to buy you some goodwill that will help you down the line.
Yeah, 1,000%. Well, I want to come back to co-parenting because this is a huge topic for so many women. But I am just curious, like after your divorce, you and I both know firsthand, like it's freaking challenging, right? And so how did there's a lot of women that are listening to this that are either, just starting going down the road of divorce. Maybe they're separated, maybe they're very newly divorced. And, this is a massive upheaval of their life. This is a massive change. And this is where a lot of women start to just get stuck and paralyzed. How did you really start to change your mindset or maybe your expectations or, post divorce to really, how did you navigate that change? What are some of the things maybe that you started to do to really navigate that change post divorce?
Well, I'll tell you about what was probably the most significant shift in my approach, and it made the biggest tangible difference in my life. So when I was married, I was living in a big house on the water that used to be owned by my grandparents. It had been in my family. It was adjacent to my parents' farm where I grew up, so my kids could see their grandparents all the time. But it was far from everything else. It was like 30 minutes from school. My friends were sort of 30 minutes in the other direction. Everything was far. And all of a sudden I find myself as like a single mom. And my situation was especially dire because what sort of precipitated the separation in my case was our longtime nanny left because she was like in her late 20s and she wanted to like live in a big city. And so she left and moved to Philadelphia. And like our marriage lasted like 3 weeks after
Oh my God.
that.
Oh my
So
God.
clearly,
As soon as you lost the second wife, right?
yeah,
Like that, it was like,
exactly. I mean, because like we kind of joke. I mean, she and I are still very close, and we kind of joke that like she and I felt like spouses, and
right.
like Tom was just this like super nice and awesome roommate that we had.
Oh my God.
So anyway, Maddie left, and then like Tom and I got separated a few weeks later. So all of a sudden, I find myself with no nanny and no husband, like having this big career and living with these two kids in this big house. And at the beginning, I felt like very focused on keeping everything the same for my children. Like I have to preserve this life in, as closely emulating the life that they're used to as I possibly can. So we're going to stay in the same house and I'm going to try to keep all the same routines and I'm going to try to keep everything as stable for them as possible. And there's a lot of child developmental scholarship to support the fact that stability is obviously important for kids. But in separation and divorce, the change is happening. Like, it's happening. You
Yeah.
can't shelter your kids from that. So I figured out pretty quickly that it was like a hot mess of a nightmare for me to like be living in that house. It was like way too much land and way too much house and way too much for me to take care of. And it was too far for everything. And I just like couldn't, I mean, I was running myself into the ground trying to make it all work. And I went out to California. I took like a little bit of time for myself, away from my kids. I knew that I needed a moment. Like, I could tell this was like a really important moment in my life. And after a really, really important sort of week of introspection, I came to a place where I was at peace with selling that house. And I was very close with my grandparents. And this was a house like I thought would be my forever house. I thought I would die in that house. Um, and, you know, I sort of like said a little prayer to my grandparents who had both obviously passed and, you know, came to this place of real peace where I realized that like my, you know, happiness and ability to function in the world is the thing that they would have cared about more than anything
Mm.
and the thing that I should care about more than anything. And I gave myself permission to sort of offload this like very cumbersome and expensive house that I had felt this really heavy emotional weight attached to it, right? Like if I'm doing right by my children, I have to sort of preserve this life for them. And after putting like all this pressure on myself and thinking that like my parents were going to be disappointed in me and my children were going to be so disappointed, but like I finally came to a place where I was at peace with this decision. And so I finally, you know, get up the gumption to like tell my parents, and I finally get up the gumption to tell my kids. And in both cases, my parents were like, "Oh, great. Now we can go to the Bahamas all winter." I'm like, "Okay." And like my kids were totally fine. I mean, first of all, Oliver was one, so he didn't have an opinion. But like Tuck, who I thought was going to be so attached to the house, was completely fine. He was like, "Oh, do you think we can get a house near the ice cream shop in
Oh my
town?" I
God.
mean,
Right. I love it.
everyone was fine. And
Yeah.
like I had meanwhile like basically almost had like this mental breakdown, putting all this pressure on myself to kind of preserve what I thought was this like perfect life for my children. And everyone was fine.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that part of it was like me putting a lot of pressure on myself to like preserve something that was already gone
Mm.
and letting myself just embrace like this new chapter. And one of the amazing things is like I got to pick my new house just for me, right? So I got to
Love
pick
that.
exactly the house I wanted, you know, and decorate it exactly the way I wanted. I picked a house half the size that was 1 mile from school so I can walk my children to school. I could walk to my office. I can, in fact, walk to the ice cream shop in town. Um, and everything's easier. I'm more able to be social because I'm right in town. So even though I have the kids all the time, like people can stop by. I can sit on my porch and talk to a friend or a neighbor after the kids go to bed. Like everything about it makes my life a million times easier and more workable. And it was such a gift. And I pressured myself for so long to sort of keep up with this old life that didn't really work in a single parent household.
You know, what I love about that, and especially if somebody's listening to this and are like, okay, well, that sounds awesome, Morgan, but like I could not move. But the takeaway is not about, moving houses. The takeaway is looking at your life and figuring out, okay, what can I do to make things, you said, more like easier and more workable for me right now, and letting go, worrying about that I'm disrupting everybody else. And I think this goes back to the whole, prioritizing ourselves above everybody else. Because bottom line is that if we're making things, even if it's simple things, right? If you have to, if there's something simple that you can change, it's just, but when we are making things easier and more workable for our lives, well, guess what? We're going to show up as better parents. We're going to show up as, better in our job. We are just going to show up better for ourselves. And so I think that's such a huge, huge, takeaway and such a great piece of advice of really adjusting to the big shift of going from divorce to a single mom of unapologetically make shit easier for yourself, girl. Like seriously.
That's right. And recognize what's not working. And if
Yes.
something's not working, recognize that you just working harder to make it work is not the solution, right? You're already working as hard as you can.
Right.
So think about structural changes that can make your life easier. I mean, in my case, it was downsizing the house and moving closer to everything, which made, a huge difference in my whole life. But that's a really big kind of colossal change. But can you telework a couple of days? Can you adjust your work schedule so you're working 4 days of 10 hours instead of 5 days of 8? There are practical ways. Can you enroll your kids in aftercare? It was always oh my gosh, I don't want my kids to be in aftercare. They come home and they like being home. Oh my God. Now I show up at aftercare to pick up Tuck and he's like, oh, mom, can't you just come an hour later? They love it. So all these things that I had sort of convinced myself were, the only way to do things. When I realized they were no longer serving me, and allowed myself to let them go and think creatively about structural changes I could make in my life to make it work better, I bought myself all of this additional bandwidth that I could then use to do things that were restful or enriching or calming or, exercise, things that make me a better person and a better mom.
Absolutely. And I got to tell you, even a simple thing, this is so funny. And I joke about this, but it's so true. Even on such a simple level, one of the things that I structurally changed in my life, and I laugh about this example all the time, but guess what? I stopped matching socks in my house. Okay. Because what I realized as a mom is that matching socks was the biggest time suck of my life. And so this is what I did. And for the longest time, how dumb this sounds, I was like, oh my God, though, but what am I being such a slack mom? What does that say about me, my kids? No, but guess what? Then I was like, you know what? I don't give a shit. And so guess what I did? I bought a bin and all the socks go into the bin. And then I actually even started buying unisex socks for all three of us. And so we just put the socks in the bin. You want socks, go in and get it. So that is such a silly example, but that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about.
It is a great example, though. It is such a good example. Another super easy example. I was like, I'm going to pay $10 per delivery to have my groceries Instacarted to my house because I dread doing it.
Yes.
It takes so much time. At the time I was billing by the hour as a lawyer. So it was clearly it made financial sense to save all that time. But oh my God, what a game changer in my life in terms of just opening up 3 hours of time in my week that I didn't otherwise have. And, my mom is so funny. She's always like, I don't know. I don't love the bananas that I'm like, you know what? I can live with bananas that aren't quite as ripe as I'll just wait a day to eat them.
1,000%.
What I was getting was so much more, it just gave me something so much more valuable. And I think that we, as women, just run ourselves into the ground trying to make things work instead of recognizing when maybe there are things we can change to make our lives easier.
Yes.
And you know what? If your kids want matching socks, they can take the time to find the matching socks.
That's what I'm talking about. Exactly. Exactly. Okay, so let's get back to some co-parenting stuff. I know a lot of listeners want to talk about this and want to learn more about this. And so, what are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen when it comes to co-parenting that we really all need to avoid? I know we talked about like picking our battles is a huge one. Any other mistakes that maybe even when they're going through the divorce process that they could do differently to set themselves up to be better co-parents, or maybe some things that when the dust settles, like what are some mistakes you see people make?
So here's a really basic and easy one. What happens through the divorce process is like it's so exhausting, and the negotiation back and forth is, you know, complicated. And by the time you get to the end and you've reached an agreement, I mean, everyone can raise their hand, and probably you and I would too. Like, how many people at the end like never actually fully read like the final version of the agreement because you were just
Seriously.
like,
Yes. Yeah.
fine, I'm just gonna like
Whatever.
sign
Yes.
it. I'm
I'm
so
so
over it.
over. Yeah.
But like once you've given yourself like a moment, um, the first thing I always say to people is like go back and really understand what the default positions are in the agreement.
Mm.
And I always really encourage people when they're negotiating agreements to always have a default position. So
Hmm.
even if you want to be super flexible, I mean, Tom and I are flexible every single day. We, kind of figure stuff out like as we go along. But there is a default position. So, like, if we don't agree about what's happening for, a Christmas break or something like that, there is a default built into the agreement. And I do encourage people to do that structurally when they're making like a parenting plan or an agreement. But once your agreement is done, go back and reread it and understand what those default positions are. Because what I see happen a lot is people ask, women in particular, ask permission for things that they don't actually have to ask permission for,
Mm.
right? Because they
Mm.
either like forget that there's a default position in there, or, maybe they've already agreed on it sometime in the past. So it's really important, particularly if you're in a high conflict situation, or you're just getting used to the co-parenting dynamic. It's really important to understand like what do I have to agree on and what do I not have to agree on, right? And if
Mm.
the default is, we're going to exchange at this time in this way, and, it's always going to be the parent whose custodial time is ending that's going to drop off the kid or whatever. Um, just stick with the default positions for a
Mm.
while, right? And try your best to wait as long as you can before you start kind of deviating from those positions. Because if you have a high conflict situation, you obviously want to minimize the amount of things that you're having to agree on,
Mm.
because it's often this like back and forth dynamic, and it can be stressful and time consuming and can suck a lot of our energy. So, understanding what you don't need the other side to agree to and when you can just stick to the default position is really, really important. I see this with clients a lot where, it's like these huge arguments erupt out of, my client going and saying, you know, can I pick the kids up at this time? And like, we look, I'm like, look at the agreement. That was the time you were going to get them anyway. Like,
Right.
it was like this huge argument over something that like didn't have to be even part of the discussion. So I think kind of revisiting the agreement, understanding what it says, and trying to stick with it as religiously as possible, at least at the beginning, is a really good way to just bring down the heat
Mm.
in at a time when the co-parenting relationship tends to be the most fraught and the most stressful, which is at the beginning. And if you have a period of time where things are just docile and everything's working okay, then after that, you can start sort of building up to like, you know, healthy communication patterns and being able to be more flexible and accommodating with one another. But often it takes that period of time when, after the big fight of the negotiation and the divorce, some period of time with less activity, low conflict, can be really healing so that
Mm.
you can then start building up new healthier patterns of engaging with one another.
Yeah, that's such good advice. Well, I think that for you and I, we both say that we've got pretty good relationships with our exes. What advice would you give the woman listening who really wants to achieve a good co-parenting situation, but their relationship with their ex is awful? I mean, where does somebody, and I don't even know how to give advice on that necessarily, because I do feel like I have a very, unique situation. It is possible to have a good relationship with your ex. Obviously, you have one, I have one. Was it easy to get there? No, but I worked really hard at it. We both worked really hard at it. But yeah, what would you say to the woman though who just there? It is very, very hostile, or it's tough, right? What does that look like?
Well, I think a couple of things. First, and I think you hit on the most important one, you have a great relationship with your ex. I have a great relationship with my ex. That does not mean that there weren't moments where it was not that,
Right, right.
right? I mean, we both have had really challenging moments. So I try to encourage women not to get discouraged if they happen to be in a really challenging moment. It's
Yeah.
easy to think like it's always going to be this terrible. And I will tell you from 20 years of practicing law and doing lots and lots and lots and lots of divorces, in almost all cases, the co-parenting relationship does improve and get better.
Mm,
Like even in the worst divorces under the sun, where people would only communicate through lawyers and everything was like messy and it went to a big trial. I mean, I'll like see on Facebook, a year later, like the parents at, with arms around each other at graduation. So in most cases, it does heal and the relationship does improve. So I want
mm,
to offer those words of encouragement at the beginning. But then in terms of some more really practical advice, first of all, one of the things I do in this new iteration of my career is I mediate. And I mediate divorces, but I also mediate co-parenting relationships.
mm,
And there are really skilled mediators out there. If your relationship is so challenging that you feel it is interfering with your ability to effectively parent your children, not just for a day, but like weeks or months on end, and if it's really interfering with making important decisions for the kids or things like that, I really, really encourage people to use the resource of a skilled and trained family law
mm,
mediator because getting a neutral voice involved, and mediators can resolve specific disputes. Mediators can also kind of like monitor communication back and forth if it's gotten to such a level of breaking down that people really can't even effectively communicate. There are lots of ways to use neutral mediators, but there are
mm,
lots of mediators out there all over the country and the world, and they're available in every jurisdiction. And that can be many co-parenting agreements, many parenting plans and divorce agreements have a alternative dispute resolution protocol that's sort of built into them that often involves mediation. But even if you don't have that in your agreement, you can always agree to mediate with the other party. And sometimes that's a really good way to get a neutral voice into
mm,
the mix. And even if the other side won't agree to mediation, let's say, um, getting a neutral voice introduced into the conversation another way can
mm,
also be a great tool. So let's say, for example, the big source of disagreement is homework,
mm,
right? Let's say, at mom's house, homework is always done diligently and turned in on time. And then when the kid's at dad's house, the homework's like not, coming in on time. And, you know, you raise that as mom, you raise that criticism. Dad says, no, 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 it's totally fine. Maybe that's a situation where you just bring in the voice of the teacher.
mm.
Hey, teacher, like, can you help us with this? We want to make sure that you're getting consistent work from our child. Is that happening? Um,
Yeah.
Often when people have a history of conflict in their relationship, which of course is almost always true if you've gotten divorced, um, if you have a history of conflict, everybody's bringing that baggage to the co-parenting
Yes.
relationship. And
Yes.
one of the big challenges is that we try to sort of shed that old baggage and think of the co-parenting relationship as a forward-looking relationship, not looking back. Like that, you know, I don't think Tom would mind me saying this publicly, but it's certainly true. Tom is a much better co-parent than he was a husband. So
I mean,
like
I say that about Frank all the time, and I love Frank. I'll tell Frank straight up. Listen, like, yeah, like you're a great co-parent. You sucked as a husband.
exactly. And
He'd probably
Tom
say I sucked as a wife too, so it's
no,
fine. But yeah.
exactly. But like, Tom and I were very incompatible as spouses. And, he had his criticisms of me and I had his criticisms of him, but it like did not work. But our co-parenting relationship works great. So,
Yeah.
I think that I really try to always encourage clients to think of the co-parenting relationship as forward looking and kind of a new thing. It's not
I
an
think,
extension of the old. It's its
yes.
own new thing. And those are a few kind of tricks and tools for like getting over that initial hump. But I really want to encourage people to sort of stick with it and not get discouraged because it does get better.
Oh, I think that's, well, number one, so encouraging for so many of the listeners, but also, I just love that, like you said, just really like sticking with it and just trusting that, and we're, well, really is like trusting that, like, and acknowledging that this is a new relationship. Like this is not an extension of your marriage. And I know one of the things for me that also helped me to release a lot of like just my like feelings of anger and like all of that is like really trying to objectively look at like, okay, you know what? He's a good dad. And this is like, he is a good dad. He was not for me. Like, we did not work out being married, but he is a good dad. And my kids need a good dad. And so I want to help foster that. And so I think, like, you're right, like trying to shed the old and just look at it as new. I think that's huge for sure.
And one more thing I want to say about this, because it really comes up for a lot of women. There is a trend that I see a lot, which is that during the marriage, women are playing the role of the primary parent. And when one parent plays the role of the primary parent, they're probably the point of contact with the school. They're dealing with all of like the homework, they're packing all of the lunches, they're scheduling all of the doctor's appointments, they're taking the kid to all the doctor's appointments. All of a sudden, what happens in separation and divorce is all of a sudden the secondary parent who's like never been involved in any of these other things before, all of a sudden is like, hey, I'm going to go to the pediatrician appointment or I'm going to, get involved in this thing. And that can be really off putting and aggravating if you've been the historical primary parent. But in the vein of like thinking about the co-parenting relationship as this new relationship, right? And that it is forward looking. It is wonderful for children, for parents that maybe historically have not been as involved to get more involved.
Yeah.
And you know who else it's wonderful for? The primary parent who's been doing everything. Like it's actually
Yes.
great to have someone like know who the pediatrician is and like know how to get to that
Yes.
office. So, I think that moms can sometimes get a little territorial. And I think also, we parent in a certain way, right? And Tom parents really differently from the way that like I parent. And like do I know that like the rules are way less strict at his house? Are they getting more screen time than they get here? Yes. Is it anything that's like damaging them? No. And the way I look at it is like if they're having a positive, wonderful time with their dad, everything else is secondary to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm not going to micromanage his parenting. I know they're getting like really good structure when they're here, which is most of the time. Um, if they're unstructured and they go to bed at 10 o'clock and they don't take a, bath when they're overnight at dad's, like I can live with that. And I think that's part of making the co-parenting relationship work is recognizing and valuing the fact that, your ex may parent differently from you, but that just brings, new and added value to your child's life. And you don't have to parent the same way all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so true. And, one of the other things I just wanted to add too, which is kind of the flip side, we're talking about like if one parent historically has been kind of the parent that just does everything, and then they could be territorial. For me, I actually had a little bit of the opposite, which was I was so used to doing everything that it was like, it was hard. Well, I guess that is in the same vein of being territorial. It was just like more so, it wasn't like I was territorial because I didn't want him to get involved. It's just, I was so used to it was always just my default to just do everything all the time. And I had to stop and be like, okay, wait a minute. You know what? He can take them to the orthodontist. He can take them to the doctor's appointment. Like I don't have to be in this role anymore. And that for me just required me like being like pausing and being like, okay, like this is not all on me anymore. Like he can do some of this stuff. And he stepped up to the plate and it's been great. But I think that I definitely especially in the first couple of years of being divorced, I was still in that like mode where it was just, I was the one just doing everything when it came to like, yeah, the doctor's appointments and this and that and all of that. And that was kind of a wake up call for me.
Well, here's a silly example, but it's kind of like in the same vein. And this was a huge game changer. And, I laugh at myself a little bit that I didn't realize I was doing it for so long. But what I used to do is every time the kids would go to town for an overnight, I would like pack everything they could possibly need in the world, right? Like all the clothes, all the extra socks, all the extra underpants, like, children's Tylenol in case they got sick, like a, thermometer, like extra toys in case he didn't have the right ones. I mean, just like all the things to the point where I was even like packing like a bag of groceries that like of stuff I knew the kids liked because I was like terrified they would show up and like he would have nothing in the fridge. And I was putting all of this time and effort into putting this like colossal package together for my kids when they would be going for like one night at dad's house. And I finally just had to be like, I am not going to do that anymore. Like he needs to get things for his house that are like, and I also have said, because we're very close and I'm okay with this and try it's not, encroaching on a boundary for me. I'm now like, hey, you know where the bag, the overnight duffels are. You can go up and pack the bag for the kids.
Yes.
If you don't have the stuff, like
Yes.
go up into their rooms, like get in their closet, like find what you need. And it just like all of a sudden I was like, oh, why was I totally stressing myself out in the middle of my workday trying to like, find the, extra underpants or the pair of jeans or whatever. Like he can do that for his time.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think like learning to pull back a little bit and learning to, let the other parent take some responsibility.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I have one last question as we wrap up because I think there's no way I could end this episode without asking this question, just because I know one of the biggest pain points for a lot of women coming out of the divorce is obviously worrying about the emotional well-being of their kids. And what have you seen help kids the most when their parents stop being a couple and become co-parents? What is like the best thing that we can do for our kids?
So this is the most important fact. And we all have immense fear around this, right? And I think what a lot of us grew up believing is that divorce is traumatic for children.
Mm.
The scholarship actually disproves that. A lot of studies have shown it is not divorce that is traumatic for children. It is parental conflict that is traumatic for children. So what's really, really amazing is that actually the separation and divorce can be this like wonderful time for kids because it often is the end of a time of high parental conflict in the
Yeah.
home,
Yeah.
right? Leading up to divorce is usually a time of really high parental conflict. And if you can imbue that period of separation and then your divorce and ultimate co-parenting relationship with greater calm, greater peace, where you're really present with your children. It doesn't mean that they're not still going to have their own grief associated with parents getting separated, because of course that is part of it. But it can really, really enhance their emotional well-being. Like dealing with grief is sort of a part of life. And so I think it's important to talk to kids about that. If kids, it's a good time to get kids in with a therapist.
Yeah.
They may or may not need it, but it can't hurt to try. And, I often say to kids, like, hey, try it for, 3 or 4 times. And if you don't find it useful, you don't have to keep doing it. But having a neutral third party to talk to can often be helpful. So, like, they are still going to have to process that grief. But the real trauma for children comes from the parental conflict. So, if you can find a way through separation and divorce to keep children insulated and isolated from that
Mm.
conflict, that is the number one thing that we can do to enhance our children's emotional well-being through separation and divorce.
I love that. And that is something so solid that we all need to remember as we're navigating this. So, oh my gosh, Morgan, thank you so much. I really just want to thank you for just this incredible work you're doing to help people navigate what can be a very traumatic time in a lot of people's lives. And so, thank you for just being a wealth of knowledge and being on the show. So appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate you and your work too, and I'm excited to collaborate in as
Yes,
many ways as
girl.
we can because there's just so, I mean, in addition to just loving every opportunity to work with you, there's also such synergy in what I'm doing and you're doing. And I think both of us in our work have chosen to take something that could have been really negative in our own lives
Yeah.
and turn it into something really positive and powerful. And I think each in their own way, maybe not in a professional way like you and I have chosen, but I mean, everybody has that opportunity to turn any major life change into an opportunity for growth.
1000%. As I always say, girl, let this setback be your comeback. So, yes, absolutely.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Well, where can the listeners find you, find more about what you're doing and how you're helping people? I know you've got some exciting things coming out related to co parenting in January. Share all of that with us, if you will.
So pivotprocess.com is my website. That's a good base for all of my social media, access to video content. As you know, I have courses that I've created, digital courses that people can access on the topic of divorce. I'm launching a new course related to co-parenting in January. That is really responsive to just an incredibly high level of interest. I'm sure you're seeing among your listeners as well. A lot of people dealing with co-parenting. And, I mean, people get divorced over the course of a year or two. People co-parent for way longer. So there's a long period of
Yeah. Yeah.
time to deal with. And so a lot of people are interested in that topic. So I'll be rolling out some more information on that. But pivotprocess.com is the best way to find all information about everything I'm doing.
I love it. And we're, of course, going to have that and your Instagram handle in the show notes. So, Morgan, my friend, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure, Amber. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.